So Amie Post has studied Bowen theory since 2001 when she was a master's student in marriage and family therapy at Seton Hill University. She was also in the postgraduate program at the Bowen Center from 2012 to 2016 and served as a clinical intern at the Bowen Center the academic year of 2015-2016. She's also a faculty member at the Bowen Center and a member of the center's board of directors. She's also served since 2015 as the executive director of the Family Crisis Center of Baltimore County, a Baltimore-based nonprofit whose mission is to assist families experiencing the impact of domestic violence. During her tenure, she's worked to understand the history of the organization and the functioning of the domestic violence system in the region over time, and to promote thoughtful program development that more readily addresses domestic violence through a family systems lens. So I'm really interested in hearing her thinking about to use her words, when chaos comes to town tonight. So Ms. Post, I'm gonna turn it over to you. Just one quick thing, if you haven't muted yourself, please do so we don't have to chase individuals down all night and mute them. And we'll be good to go. All right.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you all for being here. It's really kind of a cool opportunity to get to share some thinking I have about how families are able to respond and what does it mean to be confronted with chaos. My effort tonight is to really think Bowen theory in ways and terms that are accessible and broadly defined. So the idea I want to present is, when chaos comes to town, how do we make sense of family life in challenging times? In preparing for this lecture, I was reviewing the series of family texts that live in and around my phone. And I can't tell you the number of times where people are like, my goodness, what a crazy show this is, or just another day in chaos town, or what do we do now when the plan seems to change? If you do a quick scan of the headlines in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, consistently you see the themes of the pandemic has created a new level of chaos and challenge for families. Stressors are out the wazoo, and everything is going to be coming crumbling down if we don't start to respond to it differently right now. I've been thinking about whether or not there are ways to respond to chaos, both to understand it and also to think about it in productive and moving forward ways. So this is an effort to try and capture that. What is chaos exactly? Merriam-Webster's dictionary says complete confusion, disorder, a state in which behavior and events are not controlled by anything, or the inherent unpredictability in the behavior of a complex natural system, such as the atmosphere, boiling water, or a beating heart. What I liked when I did a Google search is also finding a physics definition, behavior that's so unpredictable as to appear random, owing to great sensitivity to small changes in conditions. And I thought, what a great word to both describe the state that we're living in, but also how our families might be organized. That we are so sensitive to small changes in conditions that there appear to be unpredictable behaviors emerging out of that system. I think Bowen theory gives us a way of thinking about it differently, and actually gives us a tool to not only get past the sense of unpredictability, but have ways of responding to it differently. So there's a scale called the confusion, hubbub, and order scale, also called the chaos scale. It was developed by Dr. Adam Matheny. He was famous for studying home environments in the Louisville twin study. At the time, it was the longest study of twins in their home environments. These were attempts to capture the background noise, or the environmental noise that provided a context for child development. And then they started to extrapolate as well on family development and functioning. In Bowen theory, we have an idea that Dr. Bowen writes about, which is this drumbeat that sits in the background. And I think chaos is one way to get at what's the noise in the background. There is an idea that is linked to this scale, that the more background noise a child has to invest energy into managing, screening out, screening in, the less energy is available to manage self and to develop. so that every time your brain has to reorient to stuff going on in the background, it's taking away energy that could be put into internal functioning. These measures have been found to be valid and reliable, and I leave experts like Dr. Collier to knowing how that happens over time. I am trusting the literature. The chaos scale is a 15-item, the short form, 15-item forced choice scale that has some true and false formats with reverse score items. When we offer it to folks in our agency, we ask these questions that are listed on the left. These are the standard ones. And they're rated 1 to 4. You agree very much or you disagree, and they sometimes reverse. So there's little commotion in our home gets positively scored. We always seem to be rushed gets negatively scored. A higher score represents higher chaos. Another way to see chaos, and this was an idea retrieved from actually PBS Kids. And I thought it was a really fun way to operationalize this visually. You can see this is kind of just a list of daily routines. When I saw it, I laughed because I kind of imagined what it would look like if I was responding to it when my children were smaller. And that's about how it looks. What's missing on here are, conflict with spouse. The dogs have gone to the bathroom in the dining room on the new rug. Your parents are calling because they need your help logging into their account. But you get the idea that you can actually visually capture the sense of background energy that it takes to just navigate daily life when you're operating from an experience of chaos. So there's a really cool article by Marsh, Dobson, and Madison, just came out in 2020 out of New Zealand. And what they did was a systemic scoping review. They looked at over 100 publications, and the consistency for choosing into these publications was whether or not the group was using the chaos scale. And then they were looking at associations between how the chaos scale measures were presented and then different types of outcomes. And what they saw was that there were some correlations and associations between outcomes and levels of chaos. So that there were outcomes demonstrated between chaos and childhood cognitive and academic development, social and emotional functioning, communication patterns, also acquisition of language, and then health and disease. The chaos scale has become one of the tools that's used to examine adverse childhood effects, and it demonstrates more often than not in the literature people trying to show a strong association between exposure to this kind of environment and long-term impacts on well-being and health. What's interesting in this systematic scoping review is that there were also looks at parenting outcomes, and they saw an association between how parents were able to do differential parenting. And as I understand that, this is the ability of a mom to say, my first kid needs this kind of response based on their reality need, but my second kid needs this kind of response, because these two children are different and they have different needs. And a good parent can respond to the different needs, not out of their own need to do something or tolerate their upset, but because the kid has a reality-based need. So there is a relationship that seems to be from how parents are reporting on the level of chaos and the capacity to respond to the reality needs of the kid. There also seems to be a relationship between the level of chaos and parenting efficacy. Both of chaos and efficacy are measured in the parent's perspective. So you can imagine if a parent's reporting that things feel like they're just constant mess and out of control, they might also be reporting that they feel very ineffective. The other body of knowledge that is explored in here is household outcomes. And this was really looked at in terms of food security and also family mealtime. There's a relationship that's explored between a family's ability to have consistent, clear, predictable routines and the experience of chaos. And if you had more consistent, clear, predictable routines, there's less likely to be a report of an experience of chaos. The question always is what comes first in that. So we tend to see the problem that others and circumstances plus the dynamics around those circumstances yield chaos, and they produce unhappy family members. And the typical pattern is we try to fix the problem by managing or changing others or circumstances to control the dynamics to make everybody feel happy. And that seems to be the way the literature is organized. If there is chaos, then you work to eliminate or manage the circumstances around the chaos. Think about what is producing this chaos. And then as you eliminate or decrease those influencers, you create space for families to be happier and healthier. What we know is that how someone thinks about something influences how we can engage it. And a lot of the effort goes at identifying chaos as a problem and trying to fix the circumstances around chaos. But if we stopped working on eliminating the upset around chaos, and we thought about perhaps a different way of thinking, we could learn something. And some of this learning comes from a very interesting finding that we experienced here in our organization. We had a natural experiment going on where a group within our program services, the program is designed to focus on safety, to meet basic needs, to help with self-soothing and containment skills. These are ideas from DBT. They're about resource connection. How do we add more to you to help you have less stressors and decrease the likelihood of chaos? And how do we help you get goals that help you take the next step around housing, childcare, and employment? The other program, funded differently and with different intentions, the focus in this program becomes on describing the problem, taking responsibility for their part in the problem, skill building on managing themselves differently around distress tolerance, emotional regulation, self-observation and reflection, goal setting, different from acquiring in the environment or having goals about resource. These goals are about who do you want to be and how do you want to show up, and then working to hold yourself accountable to those. The focus is on increased capacity to anticipate potential challenges and to maintain the pursuit of the goal when those challenges show up. All of the people enrolled in these programs in the period of time we're talking about, there were 189 folks. 169 of those folks fell on the safety side. Their chaos scores, all 189, the median was about 24. At the end of 90 days in the program side on safety, and then even some of those folks had additional follow-up time to 180 days. The chaos scores didn't change at all. The self-sufficiency score, which are basic metrics of how is your capacity to meet your basic needs, those increased slightly on this place where we focused on those needs, but the chaos scores did not change at all. Interestingly, in this group that didn't get any support on meeting their basic needs, with the focus on changing how they were going to respond to the challenges they were facing and building skills within them, we saw a decrease in the chaos scores, we saw a decrease in the perceived stress scores, and we saw an increase in their self-sufficiency scores. So while we shifted one of the variables by just focusing on safety and helping people get needs, we really seem to have stumbled upon a solution that shifts another variable in a different way. I've been thinking a lot about how chaos is just part of life, and that the more energy we put into being upset about the chaos, the less energy we have to put in to how we negotiate it. In reviewing some of the evolutionary literature and expanding beyond the family and psychological and sociological studies, one of the things that I came across was the notion that environments are necessarily unpredictable, and that part of evolution is learning how to have flexible response in unpredictable environments in ways that promote the long-term adaptation and survival of the organism. Imagine if a bacteria or the tree in your front yard or the squirrel crawling on the tree or your dogs threw a temper tantrum, launched a Twitter storm, filled out Facebook, called friends and family every time the wind blew in such a way that the leaves on the tree fell off. The squirrel couldn't find its nut. The fox stole the squirrel's stash of peanuts. Just imagine. Those species would die out way more quickly than they are. Learning to shift the thinking to chaos is just part of life and it's not a problem to be solved changes the way we can approach the challenge. I think it's important to remember some key ideas here. That the family is an emotional system and that emotional systems respond automatically in predictable ways. It's in us. The automatic and predictable response ties into our sensitivity to circumstances in the individual, between the individuals, and in the environment around the individuals. Our sensitivity gets triggered and automatic responses occur and they produce predictable pattern dynamics. And I think these dynamics are efforts of the family to adapt to the challenge. With intention, they can be modified. Change in any one member of the family automatically influences all of the others in the family. And that there's variability in the sensitivity and responsivity to challenge across and within the family. Bowen theory provides us a way of thinking about this variability, a single continuum called the differentiation of self. On one end of the continuum, you would see individuals and families whose lives are dominated by the automatic emotional system. Super sensitive, super responsive, tend to get stuck in more rigid, fixed patterns, generally find a solution and persist and persist and persist. They're emotionally dependent on all those around them, and they can be stressed into dysfunction pretty quickly. It takes a lot longer to recover from that. On the way other side of this continuum are people who have a little bit more ability, families and people, a little bit more ability to be a part of the environment, but not driven by it. They can have the response and also have a capacity to think about how they wish to move forward in that response. They are more flexible and more adaptable. They tend to be a little bit more independent. They cope better. And they are remarkably free of human problems. That doesn't mean that they don't have problems. It just means they're a little freer. In a general population, some families operate on either side. Most of us are kind of right in the middle. And on a good day, we might be able to lean toward the higher functioning. And in tough days, we probably revert back to the lower functioning. But there's flexibility for all of us. There's one major secret. An emotional system, like the family, responds to emotional stimuli. If any one member can control their response, it interrupts a chain reaction. I think this is a really, really important piece when we're shifting from trying to manage chaos or to change patterns and dynamics in a system to help us be more comfortable to when we take responsibility for kind of changing ourselves and our reaction to the challenges. So the most important factors in shifting the response is, as I've seen it and watched it kind of unfold in our clients and families across the systems that I'm watching, learn and know the difference between real and imagined threat. Become aware of the part you're playing in the automatic responsiveness. Develop ways to manage your part. Remain in emotional contact with others. And work on the slow, Very, very slow process of developing principles, beliefs, and values that can guide you when chaos comes back around. Honestly, I think part of why this whole pandemic thing has been so hard is none of us have ever experienced before. And every single part of our way of being that we had used to kind of structure and organize our lives got disrupted and challenged. Every single thing we've had to do, we've had to rethink from the ground up. It's very, very hard to change your playbook in the middle of a football game. Really successful football teams plan, prepare, practice, plan, prepare, test out some things, and they use half times to readjust. Real hard to do that on the fly. So if it were only as simple as eating yogurt, and even this little effort wasn't so simple. How do we manage self in times of chaos? I have some ideas. Stay calm, be aware. I think about that as observing yourself and the family. Stay connected and build stamina. Come prepared with essentials. Broaden your perspective. Study, predict, experiment, fail, and repeat. These are all lessons that have been gathered and collected both from watching myself and trying to do this work, but also really watching the families that are showing that variability in their exposure to chaos, but also their capacity to kind of move forward over time in it. So stay calm. I'm not quite sure what that means, actually. Maybe, better yet, contain your anxiety. The best way I've thought about this isn't that you do necessarily more mindfulness or more yoga, but it actually means beginning to notice when that automatic part of you is driving and what is its impulse. For me, I talk a lot about it as there's a crazy lady that lives inside of me. Given a chance, she will respond to what she thinks as real threat. Given the opportunity to observe whether or not it's real or perceived, I can invite that response in me to stay a part of the system, but maybe not be in charge of the system as we move forward. How does one get there? Well, I think part of that comes from being aware, and this is an invitation to begin to observe yourself and to observe your family. Some ideas for observing yourself. Stop and breathe. You can do this throughout the whole daytime. Might be important to do it right now. Just stop. Take a deep breath. Shifting from just reacting to actually being curious about what's going on in you makes a huge difference. So you can ask yourself in any given moment, if chaos is knocking on the front door, you're in the middle of the craziest show of your life on a Saturday morning in the kitchen, you can ask, am I feeling or thinking about this? If you don't know the answer, get curious. How would you begin to know when it was a feeling or thinking operating in you? Somebody shows up, knocks on the door, needs it urgent attention. Ask, what are the facts here? Not just what are they asking me to help them with, but what are the facts around the problem? What are the potential solutions that are factual? Learning to ask yourself, where does this come from? That might be your own sense of upset. It might be your concern or worry about a person. It might be your perception that others are judging. But being able to ask yourself, where does this come from? Again, it's that shift from having a feeling experience and moving it into a thinking space. The minute you can begin to observe yourself and be curious about yourself, it changes how you can experience what's around you. I think one way to start to see and observe yourself and to really begin to appreciate the family as an emotional system is to look at the family diagram. It's a tool that allows you to map out all of the individuals in this family system, to notice the facts, who was born when, where were they born, who else was around, Who wasn't around? How many times did the family move in the 10-year period before and after your birth? Family diagrams give you a way of seeing yourself as a part of a larger family system. And I think another very useful tool for observing yourself and your family are observations from coaches and from others. Not every piece of feedback is valid, and probably not every piece of feedback will ever be useful, but they are data points, and they allow you to begin to assemble other viewpoints of how you are functioning and how others are perceiving you. How you weight that, I think you skew more toward your own observations than others, but don't discount others. What will you watch in yourself? Some of the things you can watch are your feelings. Feelings are just information. Are you feeling happy, sad, glad, mad? How are you behaving? Things I watch very carefully and love it when they show up as reminders of where I am are my time management skills. If a meeting has been on my calendar and I double book or triple book myself, that's a good marker. If an important meeting didn't even make it to my calendar, that's a whole nother bucket of problem. Watching how I operate in triangles. Two-person relationships are tough. They teeter-totter back and forth in their stability. And when that teeter-totter gets worn out, there's an automatic to move toward an outside position. When I'm struggling with my partner, and I'm thinking about how to respond or relate to him differently, am I calling one of my kids and saying, hey, you would not believe what your father did this week? Or am I able to contain it more myself? Watching how those triangles show up automatically and how triangles are used intentionally. When things are overwhelmed between 2 or 3, how do you thoughtfully engage an extra person to form an interlocking triangle? Looking at in your self-relationship functioning. Are you moving toward others? Are you moving away? Are you looking to fight? Are you looking to let somebody else lead? Those are all things you could watch. Thinking about intentional. Do you have goals? Are they short-term? How do the short-term sit with medium and long-term goals? Is what you're doing today in your response to the feelings of chaos in service to your medium and long-term self that you're trying to be? How congruent is your response to any challenge today with your principles and values? How consistent and persistent are you as a person across all the contexts and in all of the relationships you're a part of? Does one version of you show up when you're at home with your family and another version show up at work? What would it look like to put those two versions more closely together? How will you watch that yourself? Remember, observing self and getting a more objective sense of who you are and how you're moving through time gives you a little bit more room to navigate when it feels like chaos has moved in and is going to take over. Watching your family over time, looking at the facts, observing triangles, who's on the inside position. These are the two people that are kind of close to each other. Who sits on the outside? What happens when one person moves from the inside to the outside? Do you know the typical pattern? Can you notice how these patterns persist over time? How does what was going on with your great-grandparents show up in your grandparents and in your parents and in you? How did these patterns respond to their own version of adaptive challenge? What was the chaos that came to town when your great-grandparents were around? And how did their patterns of responding get retained and saved as a secret superpower for you today? How do you start to ask yourself whether or not those secret superpowers are really the ones you need to bring out for yourself? Can you just imagine if Superman never learned to control his laser eyes? We'd all be melty. Stay connected and build stamina. How does that work? Well, we know this from a physiological standpoint. If I really want to build muscles, I can't just think about going to the gym. I have to go to the gym and I have to pick up the weights and I have to use them somewhat consistently. It does not work. I've tested this out in case anybody wants to know. It does not work to imagine going to the gym, and it does not work if you go to the gym once every year and a half. It has to be somewhat consistent and persistent in the effort. Building stamina to tolerate upset in yourself could look like just learning to sit quietly, slowing the automatic that exists in all of us to go and connect with another when we're upset. See if you could build a level of toleration that would allow you to sit for even 2 seconds before you ask for help. Over time, can you increase that incrementally to develop a stamina? And then in that stamina space, that capacity to slow your roll, do you have more choice in how you want to respond? Do you have more flexible options in who you reach out to? Do you have more capacity that's available even within yourself to manage without relying on someone else? The best place to work on building stamina is in your family relationship system, increasing the connections that you have with every family member, learning to have relationships with each family member as an individual, developing an awareness of when you're talking to a sibling, how long is it until you start to talk about a parent? Could you increase your capacity just to be in touch with your sibling's best thinking without needing to rely on a worry about a parent or an offspring? How do you move toward those relationships that you don't have too much traction with? That's a workout. It's almost as treacherous for me as thinking about going to the gym. How do I pick up the phone and call somebody I haven't spoken to in a while? What will it be like if I go again to the gym and nobody's there that I know? Well, you just show up. And you do the best you can when you show up. Working on being present and accounted for. This is tough, especially in a time of great challenge. Everybody is tired. Nobody wants to make the effort. We're exhausted. How do you push yourself to show up? Sometimes it's just the act of being present that makes a difference. And then you'd think this is almost an advertisement for coaching. Maybe it is. But building stamina sometimes can occur when you work with a coach. Sometimes folks have been doing this for enough time that there are ways of thinking and being and managing self that assist you in developing that resiliency. Sometimes it's just staying in touch with your coach that makes a difference. Come prepared with the essentials. I really think this quote by Dr. Bowen is important. In periods of calm, they've employed logical reasoning to develop beliefs, principles, and convictions that they use to overrule the emotional system in situations of anxiety and panic. We know this deep in our souls, what this means. You all were taught in kindergarten, if a fire happens in your house, get out of the house. If you catch on fire, I could have you all on mute. Anybody raised in the United States from 1970 forward, we know the answer: stop, drop, and roll. For kids who grew up in the late 70s and early 80s, we know we get in the car, you put on a seatbelt. It was the Make It Click campaign from Ronald McDonald and McDonald's. We know that in periods of calm, if we develop principles that will guide our action, they can help regulate automatic behaviors when things are likely to throw us off our game. You're not going to figure it out in the middle of a storm in your kitchen, but you could start to think about what's important to you when you're faced with a challenge. It was important to me to spend time every single morning, early in the morning, to sit and write and get curious about what is it I believe, who do I really want to be, and what's going to regulate me when I'm feeling overwhelmed and upset. an interesting question is to think about, what do you want your legacy to be? That could get quickly focused on how you want others to perceive you, but it could potentially be a pathway to think about, how do you want to be the best version of yourself in such a way that that lives on no matter who is perceiving you. What principles can help you keep on your path? These can be big rules, big moral ideas. I will not hurt anyone. They can be little ones like, I'm not inside outing the laundry that goes through the system because that takes more time on me. And I'm willing to tolerate the upset when the laundry comes back folded crazy because I wasn't going to put the time in it for somebody else if they didn't do it on the front end. I'm still working on this question. What am I willing to die for? I can answer it in terms of an other focus. I haven't gotten real clear on a self focus. I'm working on that. I think the important part about preparing with the essentials is knowing that this is a lifelong effort. I don't think it's done, one and done. So when you're 20 or 22, you're not sitting there coming up with life principles and then you never ever change them. It becomes an opportunity to look at what you believe and consider why you believe it, how you decided to believe it, and assessing and evaluating it over time and being willing to change it if there's new, credible, factual evidence that it should be changed. Remember, the goal isn't to get more fixed and rigid ways of being, but to really promote greater and greater flexibility and potential adaptation. These are just more questions to ponder. How would you define an idea? How would you know who's contributing to your understanding of that idea? You can start to begin to explore the family process by asking yourself, who's most aligned with this idea? Who would be most freaked out if I took this idea in my family? How do you know when you believe something because it's yours versus because somebody handed it to you? When is borrowing an idea helpful? And what would you develop to help you decide when to borrow or when to sit and figure it out for yourself? I'll tell you what, when I have a sick kid and I'm trying to decide if the kid needs to go to an emergency appointment or wait till the morning for a doctor, I'm not going to spend the time getting clear on my thinking about the GI tract. I'm going to borrow some thinking from WebMD. And then I might borrow some thinking from a trained medical doctor. I'm okay with that. I might develop some thinking about how often do I get into a worried state with a presentation of a health symptom. That could be useful. Broaden the context in which the problem is presenting. You know, I think it was useful for me to slow down and step back and not just experience the impact of the first wave of COVID shutdowns in March 2020 as something that was coming at me only. It was useful to start to think about what's going on in the bigger system. In mid-March of 2020, just after Baltimore shut down, I had a back and forth with a police officer, and we had a difference of opinions. And I took a very obstinate stance and held my ground and actually sat down and refused to do what the police officer was asking me. And initially, I felt very, very like this was personal. This officer had a problem. That problem was in him. And he needed to change because I was right and he was wrong. You can just hear how charged that thinking was. It was really useful to sit on that cold ground and stew in my own furiousness and be able to ask a question about what else is going around and how would I broaden my understanding of this dynamic emerging between us, and the dynamic not being the problem, but my reaction to the dynamic being the problem. It helped to shift my perspective a bit to ask what's going on around me and to be curious about this police officer who was 24 years old and how darn afraid he might be on his first day of global pandemic lockdown. That helped a lot. It took us several hours afterwards to still figure this out, but it helped to get some thinking space in there. It's also useful to think about what are the long-time currents in this family and the larger systems that I'm trying to swim in. How do you broaden it beyond just the here and now to seeing it as a multi-generational process that is unfolding and continues to flow in the now? And then separating out the short-term acute challenges versus this longer-term stuff. How do you narrow down the field that you're trying to influence into bite-sized chunks? I really love this idea of broadening the perspective. This is a description of how waves form. Most of us just think about waves forming on the surface, and we are watching the wind direction on the shore and the rate of the waves, and we might be able to say, oh, that wave's coming in faster because of a storm out at the ocean. What's interesting, though, to remember is that the wave dynamic isn't just the water and the wind, but it's also the terrain over which it's trying to travel. And I think this is an important way of trying to imagine it's not just the family emotional process here and now, but it's also the long-term emotional process that is operating across the generations of the family. To me, that lays down the bottom. The wind might represent more of the what's now, and the wave is how we're responding to it. If we really want to change waves and the way they're crashing on the beach, any good student of the Outer Banks knows you can change the wind. It's likely difficult to change the ocean, but if you really want to change things, go change the way the sand is organized. And so about every decade or so, the good people on the Outer Banks scoop out all the sand in this section and they push it further out, and it flattens the waves and it decreases the erosion. So you study the pattern, you predict the future, you run some experiments, and then my favorite part is you fail. And you learn from that failure and you try again. You ask yourself things like, what's the goal here? If the goal is to get rid of the upset feelings, that is a much more difficult goal. But if the goal is to create a predictable environment or be more consistent in how you plan and prepare and engage mealtime, or get more sleep, those are like really solvable problems. Asking yourself too, how is this goal different for each member of the family? What my 8-month-old grandson thinks is important to address right now is very different than what my husband thinks. What are the principles, values, and beliefs that help plan for the future and guide experiments? Can you notice when you're stuck? Are there people that you can turn to for an outside perspective? And then just the fun thought exercise of what would flexibility look like? How could you imagine the most absurd, different way of being in the middle of chaos? So no one's going to learn much without making the effort to learn. You can try to learn from others, but nothing's going to take the place of actually being out there under the kinds of conditions you want to learn about. So friends, it might be tempting to think you can go read more books or just take care of this in a clinical office. The real place to learn and grow is in the relationships with your family. And so you have to challenge yourself a bit and test the waters. And I look forward to the thinking and questions that you want to raise.
Just some instructions if folks can use the hand raise function under reactions if you have a question or a comment for Ms. Post.
Or if you just want to send cute emojis, apparently.
Well, I'm sorry, my dishwasher just turned on in the background if you can hear it, but I appreciated your presentation. I'm going to think about what my stop, drop, and roll is for the next time I call certain family members. I appreciated that analogy. Thank you.
If only it were as simple as learning a quick phrase to throw out when you're feeling the feels. I do think sometimes having a quick way to access your thinking is a useful tool. But it's never quite as simple as a throwaway, unfortunately. Ms. Harrison.
Thank you, Ms. Post. I really appreciated your reference to evolution early on, where I think there is so much to learn about adaptation and survival for other forms of life as well as our own. And one of the implications, I think, of evolution is that calm is not necessary. You described all of the other steps involved in Bowen theory, I think, that contribute to resilience and adaptation. And I would underscore that recognizing and managing reactivity is important and certainly a part of Bowen theory. But I don't know where the rumor got started that we have to be calm to do it. Evolution does not produce calm, but evolution produces the ability to be more thoughtful, observant, and manage that reactivity. I think calm is overrated. And
I hear you.
I was glad to see you describe so many other avenues for managing reactivity than meditation or some of the techniques involved in being calm. Would you say anything more about that?
Yeah, I think it's this is one of those experiments where you try something and you fail and you work to do it a little better. I was trying in that slide to connect with the perception that lives in the world, that if we could just get calmer, things would be better. And the ellipsis that followed that stay calm and then invited the next phrase, or maybe contain your anxiety, was trying to do that transition.
Yeah.
I'd agree with you. I think I spent a lot of time being pretty frustrated with my own efforts because I'm not a calm person. I'm just not. I boil at about 1,000 degrees inside all the time, and it shows up in wonky ways. But at the end of the day, I'm working to pull myself up out of that automatic and engage some thinking to have a little bit more room in how I respond.
Well, it does look, from my studies of evolution, which you certainly know, it looks like it is the ability to be intellectually active that downregulates the reactions to panic or chaos and allow us to make the most of it at both the automatic evolutionary level, but also at the level of thoughtful strategy that I think you described so well. Thanks.
Thank you. Sierra?
Hi, yeah. Thank you for everything you said. I was really interested in your perspective. And I am in the intro to Bowen right now, and I just had my coaching session. And it's just so interesting. I'm finding that looking at family dynamics, it can be easier looking back to see the patterns and the big things that maybe feel like little things, but have a big ripple effect in our families and in our own lives. I guess my question's not, it's maybe a little bit hard to grasp tightly, but I guess I'm wondering if over your years of doing this, you have found a way to understand what those moments are in your life and like how to I guess not the how to, you kind of addressed that today, but really like how to know that something right now that's happening is one of those waves that is really important for you to address it with your best self. You know, hopefully we're always bringing our best self to the table. Hopefully we're not, but I'm just interested in your feedback on that.
Yeah, I was thinking something that Dr. Bowen writes that really, I think it's accurate. The human's ability to be objective about themselves is limited at best. And it's useful for me to keep in mind that humans are more like all other life forms in our sensitivity and responsivity to one another and to challenges, then we are different. So the fantasy that we would begin to be able to see things clearly now, when I put my human functioning in the context of all other life, it just changes my expectation for what should emerge. So I don't have a good answer for what it's like for me, but I do know that when I've shifted my focus away from studying me and my miserable self and my family and trying to fix them and got curious about how other natural systems are doing life, I got some tools about how to think and observe me differently. I don't know if that's useful.
It is, thank you.
You're welcome. Ms. Rocco.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I thought there was recently something in the news where the rabbi at the synagogue in Texas talked about having trained to think through a situation. And I thought that would be another example of what you were talking about, where he and the other hostages were able to escape. You had said something, and it's something that most of us know about, if you change, another will change. And I thought, for that to work, you have to recognize that process. You have to recognize, oh, good, this is good. You know, this other person now is making an effort, rather than falling back into the reactivity. But do you have any other predictability beyond that for indicating a system? I mean, that one person changes, then another changes, then another is a predictability of a system. Do you have any others?
I think about in the family emotional system, the predictability of those patterns emerging when the threshold, if you will, for the family responsiveness to get activated. So that it would be predictable that if one or all experience something, that there are automatic ways the family is going to respond. I was thinking the confound of buying into this idea of one person changes, the rest of the family will change. The dilemma is that sometimes, I was going to say others, I'll just admit it. I have worked on changing myself with hopes of affecting a change in another. And that is, that doesn't work. That would also be, I guess that would be just as predictable, that if I'm working on changing and managing self without regard to impacting a shift in other, there's a likely shift in the whole system. There is a predictable also shift if I'm working to shift the other, but it might reinforce the patterns.
Yeah, I hear that, being clear on you're willing to take the heat for this. I also have observed that this process does not occur at a set rate. That I have seen people work on their families, do a good job, manage their reactivity over months, and no change takes place. And then, boom, something happens and they hold to that and they change. But there's no set predictability to this.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating study. Could you watch enough families over time and track the pacing of effort and the system shift that if
Well, how I've thought of that for my own practice is, and maybe this, I haven't tried to equate it to differentiation, but some families are sluggish and others aren't. And maybe that, if I try to look at that from differentiation, maybe I would understand that better.
I just read an article today in evolutionary theory that said some species are long haulers and they are slow and steady and they're hedging bets for future adaptive challenges. So their change rate is very, very incremental, plodding, sluggish, and others are fast adapters. And that there are trade-offs in the energetic allostasis load that they have to carry.
I think the level of chronic anxiety is a factor in this.
I hear you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Collier.
Hopefully you won't hear the chaos going on in my house with the son. My
Tell
son
how
is
you
getting his
respond.
bath and getting into bed. So I was hoping things would progress while I could speak. I just appreciate the real, the topic that you've chosen. I think it's really approachable and should really conjure up a lot of great discussion. But I just wanted to go back to the chaos scale and the definition. And you put that up there and it was really clear. And I thought it was a really nice review of the literature on those studies and the connections that have been made to adverse events and the chaos. But the way I think about chaos, and I was paying very close attention to those questions. I was trying to read them real fast. But the way I defined chaos, or the way that is defined, would be something that sits on the lower end of the differentiation of self scale. But I also think what sits there is not chaos, but what I will call a quiet control, which is also not a higher level of differentiation, but it is a control that can be masking the chaos, if you will, the unknowing of how to manage challenges in a family. And I have witnessed this in families that I work with, but then also in my own family, seeing different generations where there would be that chaos, like you described, that was in that scale. And then the next generation, the people would pull it together. But it would be a quiet, calm, everything's in its place. There's no yelling, but people are under pressure and it's intense. And so I think that's what sort of popped up for me when you were going through this, was, but there's this real obvious control that can be on that level as well. So I would put chaos on the left end of differentiation, lower level, the way it's described there. And then this sort of quiet control that I do believe is the equal level of immaturity. That's what came up for me.
Yeah,
because
I think you're actually outlining a very different research effort, which would be to see the relationship between chaos and differentiation. My effort was to review if you shifted the focus of alleviating the stressors or the producers of chaos to promoting differentiation, would you see a shift in functioning? So it's a little bit different. And I don't have a real strong thought formed for myself about where chaos and differentiation might overlap based on this metric.
Interesting.
Ms. Long.
Early on in your presentation, you talked about a good parent and an effective parent. And I wondered about what each of those looked like and what was the variation in their ability to handle chaos.
That is a very good question. I'm trying to pull in my head some of the articles sitting underneath this. I'm going to pull a classic teacher move and ask you, how would you approach studying that?
I think first I would have to get clear in my head in exactly how I defined what was a good parent and what was an effective parent. I think once I had those definitions clear in my head, I would go about looking to see where I might be able to study each one and how they handled chaos. My guess would be I've got a broad enough, there's enough breadth in the family that I could do it there, but I can also think of maybe there's potential to do that in a workplace, or maybe even sitting at the mall when that's possible again.
It raises for me the question about whether or not chaos in a household necessarily means you'd be an ineffective parent. We could probably interview my offspring. There were lots of mornings and evenings and weekends that looked chaotic. I don't know that I did such a terrible job. I did an adequate job. I think chaos might have more noise in the background that acts like what Catherine was saying, like chronic anxiety can act like gunks in the works of a car moving forward. Does chaos, is that an indicator of the gunk in the relationship process that inhibits the development of differentiation? I don't know, but that would be a cool experiment.
I'm also wondering, now that you've said that, if based on level of differentiation, are there times when chaos is background gunk that gums up the works? Are there times when, if there's a higher level of differentiation, if it might spur something on? But that's thinking for another day.
Yeah, that would be really fun too. We have enough families here to pull out, even in these families that are reporting very, very high levels of chaos, are there ways to observe very creative solutions to the adaptive challenges they're facing? And is it the chaos that invites the creativity? Because it's just such a much more demanding field to respond to. I don't know. I think differentiation it's not, I don't think about it as what is, I think about it as what could be.
Thank you.
Thanks. We have about 5 minutes. Dawn?
I guess I just wanted to say thank you for optimism. And what I mean by that is that the study specifically that you cited with the two groups, where kind of what you expected by supporting and scaffolding was not quite as effective as dealing with normalizing chaos. And I think of it specifically in the context that you named about COVID. And frankly, we cannot scaffold every person with every problem in this entire country and this entire world right now. But as a clergy person, I can start to normalize some of the chaos and give people, or start to think about how we deal with chaos in general, and how do we regulate ourselves. And I'm wondering if you've thought about, if you could advise the president or the WHO or some larger group, what specifically would you speak to about chaos as it relates to COVID that we could teach or encourage on a large scale?
I was just thinking you should hire Victoria Harrison or Dan Papro to be on your presidential advisory board, Mr. Bob. And then if Amie posts, we're going to put thinking in there. We spend a lot of time and energy trying to help people manage upset. And yet human beings have been around on this planet for a long time without all the help that is available to help them manage upset. How would we relate to the human species as incredibly capable and invite them to take on new and more robust levels of responsibility for their best functioning, and become more and more responsible to all the other humans that ride on this planet. And I think it does come down to a question I learned in the post-grad program. I'm sorry I've lost attribution at this point because I've heard it so many different ways. But if we get real clear on who we're responsible to and who we're responsible for, there are very few people we're actually responsible for in totality, but there's so many we can be responsible to. And that invites principled, thoughtful action in service to our long-term survival. Ryan, could you ask me an easy question? I'm a little out of brain cells.
Oh, I'll try to make it easy. Let's see. You had a comment that really intrigued me. From my concept of Bowen theory, I really focus on my responses to produce change in others. And a comment that you made earlier tonight in a response to someone here, it almost came off to me as I might be creating a will conflict, which is what I'm trying to avoid. Does that make sense?
Oh, I hear you.
Could you speak a little more on that? Because you brought it to my awareness tonight. I might be not understanding or applying the theory as well as I could.
Yeah, at least for me, anytime I try and use the theory in application at other to produce a change even that I believe would be best for other, I might even know best. That seems to, I put more, there's more in the relationship that I am burdening the other person with. Because I play a part in the reciprocity. If they have to figure out how to deal with me coming at them, even if it's in a helpful manner, then there's less available for them to just manage themselves in relationship to their own reality needs. Even with clients, we see some really upset and hurt folks. Any effort I've ever made to soothe or be for or evoke a change, hold somebody accountable, shuts down the growth in the other person. When I can just sit and be curious and invite thinking and have a mutual learning experience, that person has it in them to pick up and move forward. But I have to trust that. I don't know how to do it for you. I can just tell you what I've been trying to do for me and what I notice when I get invested in fixing or managing others versus just trying to be me.
Yeah. Bowen and Friedman both mentioned a man named Les Farber, and his book is The Way of the Wills. And it strikes me profound tonight that I have been creating will conflict unconsciously. And that is what I'm trying to stay away from.
I hear
So
you.
that's a huge awareness for me right now. So thank you for that.
It'll be fun to see what you do with all this observation of self and learning.
No doubt.
Oh, Dr. Papero.
Yeah, I've tried not to say much, Amie.
I like your thinking. Go ahead.
I thought some of the questions were very interesting. I think the question of rigidity versus the loss of structure called chaos is an interesting one. The great physiological researcher J.P. Henry suggested that there was a difference in functioning when a stressed individual organism was still making an attempt to function versus when it had given up. He thought that if I'm recalling correctly, that the stress response actually represented an individual still trying versus when all of that had collapsed and the functioning of the animal went toward passivity and helplessness, which is another way of trying to describe what chaos looks like. There are ways to think about the functions of a family unit And I've tried to lay them out as I think about them. There are other ways people can think about them. And it's only with a definition of functioning that it's possible to define what dysfunction is. And that dysfunction represents a continuum of movement away from the optimum. And no one is ever at the optimum. That's the other pitfall in all of this. When you try to set up some continuum, people pick up the optimal end and say this is the ideal, as opposed to this is a moving goal that one's always attempting to get toward, but never quite get there. So there's that piece of it. I know on the rigidity versus collapse thing is a very interesting question, because those two things are often paired as the two sides of the same coin at the very low end of the scale of differentiation of self. I've done that myself. And are we really looking here at a distinction, a very small distinction on the scale of differentiation of self, with the rigidity being a slightly higher level of functioning than absolute collapse? And I don't know the answer to that. That would be something to ponder through and think about. There was another one that came up that was very, very interesting, which has to do with the function of dysfunction. And as you know, Ms. Post, I was always been deeply influenced by the work of John B. Calhoun, the great population density researcher at the NIMH. And in his studies of animals under pressure, the population density, which is for that group of animals being studied, is the equivalent of intense stress. In other words, the closer you put those animals together, the more the stress levels go up. But under one set of conditions, Calhoun observed a rat group do something he'd never seen any rat do before, and that was create a new way of functioning. There was actually an improvement in efficiency over what the high-level functioning rats would do under optimal conditions. So in other words, you have these dysfunctional animals who, under extraordinary conditions, which means you can never separate the functioning from the context, which is really, it's so hard to keep that in the head all the time, that we're looking at functioning, which theoretically is an adaptation to conditions faced. And then for any given group, the effectiveness and efficiency of that functioning plays out in the degree of dysfunction. But under an extreme, something that is extremely dysfunctional in one particular context can all of a sudden become quite functional if the context changes. And it's so hard to keep that in mind and think about, does that make any difference in looking at how human families function and looking at any of these sorts of things? So anyway, I appreciated having to think about those things. I also listened very carefully, as I always listen, to Ms. Harrison on anxiety. And the point she made is one I would like to second. And it isn't about being calm. It's about using the metabolic, psychological, and behavioral energy that anxiety provides, and begin to use that effectively to begin the process of defining and moving on problem solving. There is a whole neurobiology now that's very well understood about how individuals, at least individual humans, move into collapse, and what's the antidote to it. And the antidote to it is basically engagement in problem solving. And that isn't guesswork. There's a research base for that out there now. But it's been known for a long time, and Bowen used to talk about this, that there's something almost magical that happens when people shift into problem solving. The anxiety goes down. And the challenge in that one is either they have to define a problem that they can keep working on, or they have to keep redefining problems in order to kick on the problem solving. So anyway, I don't know, thanks. It was just an interesting one to think alongside you about all of this. It's thanks for the talk.
Thank you. You stimulated for me thinking that I think I didn't pull through well. But one of the challenges, I think, around chaos is that different than Calhoun's experiments, where the stressors were consistent and predictable, and it allowed the adaptation to emerge. When you're in a chaotic household, the problems are so varied and they're not as predictable. So your energy, it's more like whack-a-mole. And I think that's what this literature is trying to point at. It's that it's not so much that you have a hubbub, it's that the hubbub is unpredictable, so that the energy that can be harnessed in the responsiveness at problem solving has to shift, change intention so many times that it becomes very, very inefficient in its effort to become effective. So I was thinking, like, that's why, like on the PBS site, what they say is develop rituals, start to practice consistency, meal plans, so you're not, guessworking. And I think those are other people's advice on how to create predictability that then become ways to solve problems. I got Ms. Harrison's attention too. So Dr. Papero, you all figured this out.
What you all got me thinking is, and you may have addressed this in your presentation, Ms. Post, but how much of chaos is in the eye of the beholder and how much is in fact? Where did your research go with that?
I didn't have the data, but I had anecdotal. One of this, I was working with my research team today here, and one of the people who conduct some of these interviews said, well, what are you going to do about the person who's just kind of disinterested in the responses, or they're over-reporting or under-reporting? And I thought, that's a really fascinating question. How does the disinterest or the over or under report actually reflect a perceptual bias that is related to the level of differentiation or chronic anxiety operating in that system at that time? So it's a question. I don't have a good answer, but I am curious to think about that.
You begin to get into the area of distributed perceptual frameworks, which is another absolutely fascinating area that Bowen gets at in his concept of the undifferentiated family ego mass, which has been so badly misunderstood out there that it's shocking. It is, and you begin to get into this area that in the research literature is often referred to as distributed cognition. And one of the values of interpersonal communication within a family, maintaining contact broadly, is that there is always a corrective viewpoint to one's own skewedness. In other words, the collected perception or field, if each individual is working on a viewpoint for self and reporting it into the common, there is a bigger pool of information about objective reality to draw upon, which allows each individual within it to make a better decision for self. A better decision for self affects the better decision of the collective. I mean, that's said not very clearly and not very well, but it's a very, very important area to think about this, the collective field of perception, the family perceptual field, and the degree of fusion or autonomy and connectedness within it, which allows the development of this broader cognitive processing, which produces a very different perception of reality and a very different set of potentials.
Yeah, and right there, you set up the springboard to think about societal emotional process, because the degree to which there's a fusion between the family's perceptual framework and the system, the helper systems, you could distort what is being taken in or understood. I think that's what we do in the DV world sometimes. We re-victimize by labeling victimhood.
I hear that one. Let me stop, Amie. I can go. Victoria and I can get going, and I can keep talking all night, so I'll just be quiet.
All right, you're done for tonight, Ms. Harrison.
Oh, well, I will soon be done, I'm sure. I've been going through files of letters. I can shift my computer, I think, and show you. Yeah, shelves of files of letters and records since 1977. And realizing how much I was, as a child growing up, well aware, I sensed the level of tension, frustration, anxious reactivity in the family, none of which was confirmed by any of the adults around me. And I've been rereading and piecing together how valuable it has been to be able to look back and have some delayed confirmation of the perception of chaos or the perception of emotional reactivity that I would pick up on as a child and wonder what was going on, where it was coming from, and without confirmation or thinking of any of the adults, oh, everything is okay, kind of thing. How difficult it is to develop one's accurate sense of emotional process. Really, it was not until I began to talk with Murray Bowen that he then raised questions that confirmed my sensory perception of what was happening in triangles, for example, that the theory is such an important tool for being able to organize one's perceptions in a way that brings pattern to chaos. Really, it's an interesting project and challenge, I think, perhaps a lifelong one. But that's what your presentation and the discussion with Dan Papero brought to mind about how much the research into family history really allows more objective observations that reduce chaos. I don't know that it's predictable. What is it other than chaos and predictability? What's in the space between those? Because I think that's where evolution happens, in the space between chaos and predictability. Anyway, thank you for stirring these thoughts.
I was trying to think about what kind of tattoo I could get that would demonstrate that space between chaos and predictability. That would be a good one to remind myself of. I just would like to invite, if there are any other folks who would like to jump in. I'll reflect back when I came to one of these a long, long time ago, and I heard, oh, Dr. Papero and Ms. Harrison talk with somebody else. I thought, I'm not smart enough to jump in there. And I would imagine you are. So if you have a question that's sitting in your head, now's a good time to just throw it out. And if you want to follow up with Dr. Papero or Ms. Harrison or Dr. Collier or any of the other faculty at the Bowen Center, the website is a friendly resource for email addresses. Feel free to jump on that and connect. And I will just say thank you for your listening and your questions. It helped me get clearer in my thinking. I'm really grateful to have spent time with you tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Post. It doesn't seem like anybody has anything. So I just want to take a second and plug our next Thursday night professional lecture, which is going to be on February 10th. The title is The Only Workplace Where You Really Do Bring Your Family Systems and Congregational Life. And we're going to have Reverend Amanda Poppy present on sort of her work using Bowen theory in congregational life. And she's also going to, after her lecture, going to have a conversation with one of our faculty members, Jake Morrill, that I think is going to be really interesting. And that is on the eve of the Faith Leadership Conference. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And thank you again, Amie Post.